Okay, so welcome to another program of the Monroe County History Club. My name is Michael Carter, and welcome to my wife Paulette and my cousins, 3 cousins who attend regularly. This is kind of a special day for the group. This is our birthday. Happy birthday to us. It's number 12. We started in February of 2013. A group of 6 like-minded people met in a small room downstairs at the Monroe County Public Library. Besides me, there were Skip Chambers, George Carpenter, Donna Stogstall, Shelby Kaiser, and the late Sarah Robertson. We had met each other on Facebook, basically, and we knew we had interest in local history. And I don't even remember what we did at that meeting. I think took some pictures and old newspaper articles and things like that. But then the room was kind of small and there were no windows on it. Christine Friesel had something to do with sending us down there. She's at the library. She thought Skip and I made too much noise in the Indiana room, so she set us up down there. But thanks for that, Christine. The thing was, they made me give it a name. I wasn't going to give it a name. There wasn't anything to name. We were just getting together, but according to their rules, you have to have a tag, a name or something. So on the spot, I just came up with Monroe County History Club. I was going to call it Bloomington History Club and then cross that out and then change to Monroe County History Club because it does entail the whole county. Also, I left some sheets of paper on the tables. Don't fight over them. It's just like the next 10 programs we're having. It's a short thumbnail of the programs. Many thanks to the American Legion for all the help they've given us over the years. We really couldn't do this without them. There's no other place we could have this at. You know, serves food and has this free parking and everything, and all this room we have in here. And it's the best venue for these programs. And thanks to the wait staff too. Be generous with them. And the kitchen staff. Also like to thank Catch TV, and we have our personal cameraman, Dave, back there, erstwhile cameraman. They've been here helping us for 9 of those 12 years, and that's really important because it gets all these programs on their channel, and then it also I upload them to YouTube every month, and we get a lot of views from these programs. A lot of people watch those. Do we have any new people here for the first time? Got a few there, I see. I don't know if you see our programs on Facebook or the ads, but if you don't, some people don't get on social media, so if you want me to contact you by your email address, just write that down and give that to me later, and I can give it to George Carpenter, and he'll put it on our list. So, first of all, though, we have a couple of people going to give a few words. Christine Friesel.
Hi, everyone. I just want to promote a program at the public library at the downtown library next Tuesday night. We're showing a movie called A Generation at War. This is a locally produced documentary film about the impact of the Civil War in the middle of Indiana, or middle Indiana. This highlights Putnam County, Indiana, but it talks about how that county and the community coped with the dramatic changes and impact of the Civil War before, during, and after. And so that is next Tuesday night at 6 p.m. at the downtown library. Of course, it's free, so please come and watch that movie. You might think, hey, you don't care about Putnam County, but this program will show you an example of how Middle Indiana dealt with it, and I'm sure if you're familiar with it, how Monroe County did in the Civil War. It'll probe some interesting questions for you, so please come. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Christine. Well, next, Daniel Schlegel, the director of the History Center, would like to say a few words.
All right, thank you, Michael. I'll be brief. I just want to let everyone know we have new exhibits. We have a quilt exhibit about Rooted in History. It's a really neat exhibit that we did in conjunction with SACWA. Don't ask me what that stands for, I just know the initials. But if you like quilts or have any connections to them, it's definitely a neat exhibit to come out and see. And while you're there, we also have an exhibit about the 50th anniversary of the African American Arts Institute, AAAI, that is in our Hill Gallery. And then for anyone, does anyone remember going out to see the History Center about 3 years ago when we had our restaurant exhibit that was up? We have restaurants too. That one was so popular, we brought back a new version of it with all new restaurants and all new things to read about, all new history. So please take the time and come out. This is a fresh look with all new things to see in that exhibit. So make sure to take the time. You can see all 3 of those at once. And the other big thing we have is our garage sale extravaganza coming up in June. So if you're doing some early spring cleaning, especially on a nice day like today, make sure to think about our garage sale ladies. On Wednesdays from 10 until 2, they're accepting donations out at the garage sale site. I have little quarter sheet flyers you can pick up, or you can just come ask us at the History Center. We'll let you know. Otherwise, we just have a smaller than normal table right over here with all kinds of books and anything new we have. So make sure to stop by after the talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Daniel. So I'll just mention a couple of our future programs. Next month, March, will be Forest Fire Lookout Towers of Indiana by Tina Ligman. And actually, that's why she's not here today. She was going to come, but somebody, a big shot at Crane, is showing her some fire towers out there. I didn't even know they had any, so she's adding to her list. And then April 29th, Nan Brewer is going to give a program that I think should be really interesting called From Chicago to Bloomington, Thomas Hart Benton's Indiana Murals. A lot of you are probably familiar with Thomas Hart Benton. Some of them are kind of controversial, so that should be interesting. That brings us to today. This program is called, well, it's something most of us probably know nothing about. I know I didn't, but it's about the Mormons moving into the Salt Creek Valley area way back in the 1800s. And I won't say any more about that. I'll let Jill Vance speak to that. And by the way, Jill, she gave a program this time last year on Monroe Lake, which turned out to be our most views by far on YouTube. Well over 7,000 views, which is amazing, because it's about double the next one, which is by my buddy Clay Stuckey on D.C. Stevenson, which had about 3,500, I think, which is a lot in itself. But it shows how many people watch these all over the country, really. So here we go, Jill.
All right. Yeah, my name is Jill Vance. I'm the Interpretive Naturalist at Monroe Lake, which I'm sure everybody in this room is aware of and where we are. And this is a little bit of a niche subject. I probably, like a lot of you in this room, I tend to get like down rabbit holes. And this was a rabbit hole I started going down. And it turned out there was all kinds of stuff in it once I went down it. When I started out with the ideas for this program, I thought it was going to be kind of a relatively simple program to put together. I had some good newspaper articles about Mormon activity in Salt Creek Valley. But as I started kind of putting together what the storyline was and what was happening here locally, I realized it's really part of a broader story. And to understand what was going on here in the Salt Creek Valley, you've got to understand what was going on a more nationwide level. And you need to understand some history of the early Mormon church, which I'm going to say up front, I knew nothing about coming into this. This is something I had to go into and do a lot of research. So when you deal with religion, it can be very controversial, it can be very sensitive. And so I've had some people connected with the LDS Church, some people who were brought up in this religion have watched this program. They say I did a pretty good job at getting things correct. So I hope that is the case. But I do want to be upfront. If you are connected to this religion and I have gotten something wrong, please come up and talk to me so I can get it corrected. for the next time I do this. So this is going to be, I really focus on fact-based narrative when it comes to the history of the LDS or the Mormon Church, because I want to focus on the portions of the church's history that are most relevant. This is kind of poppy. If I hold it right here, can you guys still hear me? Okay. I gotta find the right distance. Usually I'm just yelling, so I'm not used to having mics. So I wanted to focus on the parts of the church history where you can really understand why people here in southern Indiana often reacted negatively, occasionally violently towards Mormons. And so I hope as viewers, you'll also approach this subject matter objectively and respectfully. Okay, so let's dive in, because there's a lot to dive into. So in the late 1800s, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began sending regular missionaries out to the Salt Creek Valley region. This is a rural area in south central Indiana. It's roughly stretching from Bloomington south to Bedford and then east over to Nashville. And we're going to be looking at the early history of this religious group, which is popularly known as the Mormons, and you're going to hear me referring to them interchangeably as the LDS Church and the Mormons. I think the preferred term, it would be LDS Church nowadays, but Mormons are still kind of what a lot of people call them, and more importantly to this presentation, that's how everyone referred to them in the 1800s. So that's the term, I'm going to use that terminology. We're going to be looking at the history of this group through the perspective of people who were living here in the Salt Creek Valley region during this time. We'll look at how anti-Mormon sentiment developed and see how people often expressed their disapproval of this young religion through sometimes quite violent actions. And we're going to focus also on how the Mormons impacted one specific family that was living in Salt Creek Township, and that's the Chandler family. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, again, also known as the Mormon Church, they trace their origins to the western portion of New York State. And it was there in the late 1820s, a young man named Joseph Smith began attracting followers. And he was dictating a text that would later be published in 1830 as the Book of Mormon. So Smith preached that this book contained the writings of ancient prophets who he believed lived in the Americas from 600 BCE to 421 AD and recorded their insights on a set of golden plates. So he claimed that the last prophet to contribute to this book then buried the plates in a drumlin that was known as Hill Cumorah, where they then laid hidden until the location was revealed to Smith by an angel. Now, the Book of Mormon contains doctrinal discussions, there's critiques in it of Western society, and most significantly, and the origins of the church's official name, there are claims that there are biblical prophecies in this book that may be fulfilled by Latter-day Saints, so people living in the more modern world. There's a very pivotal event in this text, which is the appearance of Jesus Christ in the Americas shortly after his resurrection. Now, a month after publishing the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith organized the church's first legal entity. And this church actually grew pretty rapidly in popularity, and they revered Smith as a modern-day prophet or a Latter-day Saint. In January of 1831, about 75 of his followers moved with Smith to Kirtland, Ohio, after being invited there by a man named Sidney Rigdon. And this was a local preacher who had met with Mormon missionaries and had been intrigued by this new religion. During the same time period that Smith was growing his Church of Latter-day Saints in New York and then Ohio, white settlement in the Salt Creek Valley of Indiana, which has portions of modern-day Monroe, Brown, Lawrence, Jackson counties, and even a little fragment of Bartholomew in there, was also growing. And so our earliest arrivals settled in the valley generally entering the 1810s, followed by a major influx of people to the Salt Creek Valley region in the 1820s and the 1830s. And they were largely coming from Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas, kind of this region that we know as the Upland South. Residents of the Salt Creek Valley then formed these economic and social connections to developing towns, Bloomington, which was founded in 1818, and Bedford, which was founded in 1825. And in the 1820s, we start to see newspapers appearing in this region. They are reporting both on local and national developments, and boy, howdy, are they reporting a lot of gossip, tons of gossip. And there's not really firm lines between the news and the gossip. It's just kind of all mixed in there together. So very hard to separate news from opinion, and that's going to become important in some of the coverage that we're going to see. Illiteracy was pretty widespread during this time period, but what would happen, you know, is a person in your community who might be able to read, who would get the paper, would read it through, and then that news would get spread orally to your neighbors, to your family, your friends, and word would get around that way. Now, there's very few editions of these earliest local papers that still survive, so it's really hard to say how much information was available to locals here about Joseph Smith's small but growing movement. Very possible, though, that few, if any, area residents had even heard of the Mormons before they came to Ohio, and maybe even not after they came to Ohio, because, you know, these are people, the Mormons were coming out of the New York region, and our people are coming out of the Upland South region. So there's not a lot of family connections, there's not letters being passed back and forth, you know, between people who are living here, with people in New York. They don't have family connections in that area. So they probably did not really realize or knew anything about this new religion that was starting to get pretty big. Now, Joseph Smith intended for Kirtland to be a temporary home for the church. Within just a couple months of arriving, he started sending a constant flow of new followers out to Independence, Missouri. This is a location which Smith claimed was the location of the biblical Garden of Eden. And this new Missouri settlement was going to be a New Jerusalem, or a city of Zion, where the church would welcome the second coming of Jesus Christ, as foretold by Smith. Now, the first Mormon missionaries to Indiana arrived by summer of 1831, and they started preaching in Madisonville, Unionville, Vienna. In 1832, Joseph Smith himself actually even made a visit to our state. He stopped in Greenville, down here close to New Albany, while he was traveling between Ohio and Missouri. Now, there's an article published by the Bedford Weekly Mail decades later that recollected that southern Indiana was a, quote, fruitful field for Mormon missionaries in the 1830s, and that hundreds of proselytes from the state were sent on to help settle Independence, Missouri. The oldest surviving mention of Mormons in a Bloomington, Bedford area newspaper that I have been able to locate comes from January of 1836. But it's very clear from the writing in that article that the Mormons were a known entity to people in this area by 1836. So clearly there had been newspaper articles that just haven't survived, or I haven't found yet, that predate that one. Now, after a warrant was issued for Smith's arrest on the charge of bank fraud, he decided to move the church headquarters a bit earlier than he had planned, and he departed for Missouri in January of 1838. Over the next few months, most of the Mormons who were still in Kirtland followed Smith out to Missouri, including a new convert named Brigham Young. Now, there was already tension between Mormons and non-Mormons in Missouri before Smith arrived. Followers were kind of arriving there in large enough numbers that they were starting to influence local politics. They were forming their own militia, separate from the town militia. This was a Mormon-only one. There was a Mormon-run newspaper that had been set up that was also publishing Smith's revelations that Mormons were entitled to the land and independence and that they should take it by force if necessary. The flip side of that is that local non-Mormon militias were also forcefully taking land that was rightfully owned by the Mormons. So it was going both ways. It was a very tense situation. Now, August 19th, 1836, the Bloomington Post reprinted a letter from a man in Missouri who mentioned that while a recent lawsuit had just been resolved, quote, "The Mormon question is not yet settled in this country, nor will it be, in my opinion, as long as any of them remain here." There have been small-scale skirmishes that have been occurring periodically for years, and Smith's arrival in Missouri, it was just fuel for those flames. The violence escalated through the summer of 1838. It became known as the Mormon War. And on October 12th of that year, the Bloomington Post published an excerpt from the September 27th edition of the Missouri Watchman, which declared that the difficulty with the Mormons is amicably settled and quite restored. It was most certainly not. The violence continued. And it actually led to the Missouri governor issuing an executive order on October 27th that called for either the expulsion or extermination of all Mormons from the state. And it's worth noting that that order was not officially repealed until 1976. Now, 3 days later, there's an unauthorized Missouri militia that kills 17 members of the church, including multiple children, at the Haun's Mill Massacre. So Smith and his followers moved to Illinois and to Iowa, and he founded the town of Nauvoo, Illinois, next to the Mississippi River in 1839. Following that massacre at Haun's Mill, there had been a big shift in public sentiment in favor of the Mormons. However, those same tensions that had led to violence in Missouri eventually resurfaced at the settlement in Illinois, as Smith was building a thriving theocracy in that community. He also claimed to receive 2 more key revelations, both of which would be controversial from the start. One of those is the baptism of the dead, which is, on a little side note to there, if you've ever done genealogy research and have dug into the LDS's church's archives, that all comes back to that revelation, and wow, they are immense family history experts. I've relied on their database for tons of stuff, tons of my history programs, and that all started with that revelation about the baptism of the dead. And then the other one, which was, we could say, a lot more widely cared about at the time, was the revelation of plural marriage. Now, that revelation on polygamy remained mostly a secret amongst just the church leaders until a Mormon who was opposed to the practice published an expose in June of 1844. And Smith's response to that expose was to order the destruction of the newspaper's press in Nauvoo, which led to a charge of treason against him for violating a citizen's constitutional right to free speech. So Joseph Smith and his brother were jailed in the nearby town of Carthage, where an angry mob then stormed the building and both of the men were killed. following the death of Joseph Smith and his brother, we have a succession crisis in the church. So there needed to be a decision on who is going to lead the Latter-day Saints, and that fell to the Quorum of the 12. This was a governing body that Smith had established. Brigham Young, who had been the current quorum president, was elected to lead, but his elevation was definitely not unanimous. Some decided to follow other leaders, and that ended up giving birth to the first splinter denominations. And that's going to become relevant later. So due to continued tension in Illinois, Brigham Young led the main body of the church to the Great Salt Lake Valley in 1847, and the members settled outward from there. And their intention was to pioneer a new state that they planned to call Deseret. So many of the Latter-day Saints who remained behind in this region, in the Midwestern states, were people who rejected the leadership of Brigham Young, and they believed that one of Joseph Smith's sons would eventually rise to lead the church. Smith's sons and their followers disagreed with the direction that Young was taking the church. In particular, they objected to the idea of plural marriage. So due to the secession crisis and then the subsequent splintering of the LDS Church, along with the move of the main church body out to the Utah Territory, we see a sharp decline in missionary work in Indiana right after the death of Joseph Smith. And LDS members who were living here in Indiana became increasingly isolated from the main body of the church. Now, after he arrived out in Utah, Brigham Young built on that theocratic model of governance that he had pioneered in Nauvoo. So he incorporated the church as a legal entity, and then he proceeded to hold power both as a religious leader and a political leader. And he was actually appointed governor of the Utah Territory in 1850. Now, after that 1844 expose about Joseph Smith's plural marriage revelation, which directly, indirectly, depending on how you want to look at it, led to his death, the church had mostly managed to kind of close the door on that and continue to keep knowledge of that revelation from spreading wider in the church. So it remained a secret from converts as a whole, from those outside the church as well, until Brigham Young actually publicly acknowledges it in 1852. And that announcement causes a sensation. People throughout the United States were already kind of growing increasingly uncomfortable with the theocratic governance in the Utah Territory. And layering polygamy on top of that had many Americans were questioning the Mormons' loyalty to the nation. Now, were people here in the Salt Creek Valley region having similar thoughts along those lines? Possibly. However, it seems that the sentiment in this area remained somewhat neutral toward the Mormons for several years, based on the articles that I found from local newspapers that survived from 1854. These articles included things like a reprint of a complimentary description of the Great Salt Lake settlement and the household of Brigham Young on February 11th. There was a reproduction of a Brigham Young's proclamations on May 26th, and even a positive anecdote about Joseph Smith that was published in the local papers on April 20th. And most notably, on October 7th, Bloomington newspaper addressed a debate between the editors of the Bedford White River Standard and the Madison Courier on whether or not Utah should be barred from statehood due to its allowance of polygamy. And the interesting thing here is that the writer, commenting on this debate that these newspapers are having, points out that Indiana's own state constitution was actually currently completely silent on the, quote, subject of marriage relations. And he argued that it was dangerous to draw a line that was based on religious practice. pointed out that the Utah Territory was also an economic powerhouse that would be way more valuable to have inside the Union than without it. By 1855, though, that tolerance had faded significantly. News coverage here shifted decisively against the Mormons. There are accusations against Brigham Young. Again, these are being published in our local papers, accusing Brigham Young of rigging juries, openly defying the U.S. government, and postulating that the saints were the least saint-like people around. And by 1857, the Mormons' teachings on polygamy and their promotion of a theocratic government had once again created this tense situation between them and their non-Mormon neighbors. And this prompted the Utah Mormon War. And this was a confrontation between Mormon settlers in the Utah Territory and the U.S. government. And it peaked with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And this is a situation, 150 immigrants coming into the area on a wagon train were killed by Mormon settlers. Now, the conflict ultimately ended when Brigham Young agreed to step down as the governor of the territory in 1858. However, the LDS Church continued to wield massive political power in the territory. And under Young's influence, the practice of polygamy continued to spread. At its peak, an estimated 20 to 25% of adults in the church were living in a polygamous household, and that included about a third of women of marriageable age and almost every single membership of the church's leadership. Now, although polygamy in the territories had been declared a felony by the 1862 Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, it wasn't enforceable. The Mormons were the political power, and they were not going to enforce that in the territory. That remained the case until the jurisdiction for enforcing the act gets transferred to federal prosecutors and courts in 1874. And we see newspaper coverage of Mormon polygamy in Indiana that is just full of exaggerations, sensationalism, mocking jokes. It's just all over the place. I mean, they're talking about, like, to be fair, Brigham Young did have a lot of wives. He did not have over 100 wives. And these are the kind of numbers that start getting bandied around. But the coverage also highlighted this deep-seated fear that many Americans had of a government that was held in thrall to a church that was not their church. This spawned speculation and conspiracy theories about Mormons in the same way that we have seen even a lot more recently with Protestants fearing that if you elect a Catholic to the U.S. presidency, you're going to give the Pope control of the country. It's that same idea. In the early 1870s, we start seeing reports of lectures being held in Bloomington and the surrounding areas about the evils of Mormonism in general, and polygamy in particular. Not coincidentally, I am sure, these lectures coincide with an increase in reports about Mormon missionaries being active in southern Indiana. So the Bloomington Progress noted that Elder Lee, one of the 70 saints of Utah, had been proselytizing in Monroe and surrounding counties throughout the summer of 1872. And this is some article to read, because the writer really goes out of his way to give an unappealing as possible physical description of Elder Lee. And I mean, he really goes crazy with the adjectives here, and tries to make his argument for converting sound absolutely absurd. He also accuses the elder of deliberately targeting, quote, rural districts where he finds numerous converts among the poor, weak-minded, and ignorant. So when Young died in 1877, he was succeeded by prominent members of the church who continued to hold sway in the political arena, continued to promote polygamy, and to expand the role of LDS missionaries in the United States and other mostly Western countries. So they were going overseas as well. Joseph Smith had called upon his younger brother Samuel to serve as the church's first missionary in 1830. And that became a model for members of the church to follow after in helping to spread this faith. And from 1830 to 1899, there were close to 13,000 believers in the church who served as missionaries to try to convert new followers. In the early 1880s, local newspapers began regularly publishing reports of Mormon missionary work, both here in the States and abroad. The sometimes unspoken, but let's be clear, it was often expressed, worry was that if they were left unchecked, the Mormons might accumulate enough converts to replicate their theocracy model in other parts of the country as well. Now, you have, for some people, the very idea of a theocracy was repellent. That was the problem. You cannot have a theocracy in the United States. They just objected to that model, period. But we've got to be honest here. For others, it was the particular brand of theocracy that they objected to. Because a lot of other Christian denominations believed, and still do, that Mormonism was a non-Christian fraud. They weren't necessarily opposed to a religious group having control over the country, just not that religious group. Now, not all missionaries represented that main LDS church. So some of them were from splinter sects. These are people who generally believed in the Book of Mormon and the preachings of Joseph Smith, but they rejected the practice of polygamy. And these anti-polygamous Mormons are the ones who tended to have better luck at finding converts in areas like southern Indiana. Because plural marriage in this area was a socially ostracizing offense. The Bloomington Progress reported in January of 1881 that a colony of such Mormons had been flourishing for years in Clark County. Now, as part of the political power struggle for the Utah Territory, the U.S. Congress passed the Edmunds Act in 1882. And this prohibited not just bigamy, but also bigamous cohabitation. So trying to get around not being able to marry more than one person by basically being married to them in all but like having the legal document. You still had multiple wives, but only one of them would be legally recognized. Well, they banned that bigamous cohabitation as well. And so the act went pretty far. It also vacated the Mormon-dominated territorial government. It disenfranchised any present or former polygamist, and it allowed the government to deny civil rights to polygamists without a trial. Now, newspaper reports often didn't distinguish between the missionaries of the main LDS church and those anti-polygamous sects, and it's abundantly clear that the average citizen rarely bothered to differentiate between them, unless they were actually interested in converting. Prior to 1882, there was no permanent missionary presence here in Indiana, but that changed when Indiana became part of the Northern States Mission, which began proactively assigning Mormon missionaries to the state. And so in 1883, kind of going along with that increased presence, we see this big jump in local newspaper coverage about Mormon activity. These stories often spoke approvingly of instances where missionaries were harassed, attacked, or driven out of local communities. So, for example, in 1883, they reported on the egging of Mormon elders attempting to hold meetings in Carroll and Cass counties, the tar and feathering of elders in Brookville, 2 missionaries that were run out of a church in Paragon, a pair of elders threatened with a corn knife in Franklin County, and the denial of Mormons who wanted to preach in a Columbus church. One of the worst incidents to happen here in Indiana occurred in Crawford County in July 1880. Where 2 Mormon elders and 2 of their female converts were lashed so severely that 2 of them died from their injuries. And that attack occurred less than 3 weeks after the same elders had been repeatedly hung from a tree by a group of white cappers in Kentucky until they consented to leave the state. And they had fled to Indiana after that. And the coverage that we see is not limited to Mormon activity in Indiana. So during that same year of 1883, there are stories published in our local paper about elders being egged and chased in Tennessee and Georgia, lynchings threatened in North Carolina, and attempts to ban Mormons from crossing state lines. The claim that Mormon missionaries deliberately targeted the poor and uneducated was a refrain that was oft repeated by newspapers, both here locally and throughout the country. And they often also attributed Mormon success to a strategy of focusing on women, which the newspapers often referred to as inherently more vulnerable and corruptible. So pushback against Mormon polygamy was escalated again by the federal government with the Edmunds-Tucker Act in 1887. And this allowed prosecutors to force plural wives to testify against their husbands. It abolished the right of women to vote, which the territory had granted to women in 1870, first place in the country to do that. It disincorporated the church, and it confiscated all of the church's property. Around 1,300 people, most of them men, were convicted of polygamy in the 1880s, and they served prison sentences of 5 to 6 months. And many of the church leaders went into hiding during this time period to avoid prosecution. So against this backdrop of often violent persecution and political pressure, Mormon missionary activity here in Indiana increased. Around 20 missionaries are believed to have been active in Indiana during the late 1880s and the 1890s. 1889 in particular seems to have been a key year for seeking converts down here in the southern part of the state. There is an article on February 16th, 1889, notes that missionaries were proselyting in Du Bois County. The same elders are referenced again in March, preaching throughout the larger area that included Crawford, Harrison, and Lawrence counties. And during one of their visits to Du Bois County, they were dragged into the woods, stripped, and each given 25 lashes, and then a warning to be gone from the area before daybreak. One of the elders managed to travel 24 miles overnight, and he escaped to the town of Winslow. His companion was unable to keep up and is presumed to have died from a combination of exposure and his injuries. And then we see 2 other elders who were at work in the Corridon area, where the newspaper reports that they were egged in mid-March. And then on March 29th, 1889, we get the first article about Mormons preaching in the Salt Creek Valley specifically. The elders are reported to be from one of the anti-polygamist denominations, but apparently had or were presumed to have favorable views of the main LDS church. It's likely the same pair of elders who were then preaching in nearby Washington County in June, as it was really typical for missionaries to kind of move throughout this multi-county region. In early August, one of these elders, Charlie Hyde, held meetings in the Chapel Hill area of Salt Creek Valley, and he was also seeking converts in rural areas of Lawrence County. It's likely during this summer that a 64-year-old man named Silas Grantham Chandler first heard the Mormons speak. And Silas Grantham Chandler was born in Washington County in February 1828. So during that same time when Joseph Smith was beginning his work transcribing those golden plates from Hill Cumorah, the Chandlers moved to Monroe County while Silas was still an infant. At the age of 19, he enlisted in the U.S. Army along with one of his brothers, Isaiah. They both served in the Mexican-American War, fighting in different regiments of the same company. Silas ends up being honorably discharged due to a lung wound after about a year in service, but his brother Isaiah never makes it home from the war. I believe is actually buried in Mexico. By 1889, Silas had owned his Salt Creek Township farm within the Salt Creek Valley for over 40 years. He had been married for 35 years of that to his wife Lizzie, and fathered 13 children, of whom the 6 youngest, all of which were daughters, were still living with him at home. It's pretty likely that the family were attending the nearby Friendship Baptist Church, as many of their neighbors were founding members of that congregation. And Friendship Baptist Church is an interesting story in and of itself, and the remnants of its foundation are still present around the lake. Now, news that the Mormons were in the area would have spread quickly, and it would have been fodder for a lot of gossip and speculation. Entertainment options were limited, to put it mildly, in these rural areas. So some people would have attended these teachings solely for personal amusement. Others showed up with more nefarious intentions. They were there to heckle, they were there to threaten, which to them might also have been entertainment. And then there were some people who would have come to these teachings who would have been genuinely curious about what the elders had to say. Now, Silas may have traveled to the Chapel Hill School to hear the Mormons preach, or perhaps the elders made a stop to speak at the Butcher's School, which was only about a mile from his home. We don't know what motive originally drew Silas to listen, but something that he heard in one of these meetings sparked an interest. Now, although Silas and his wife Lizzie were illiterate, they had likely heard stories already about the informal debate that had been held in Greene County between a Protestant elder named Kritzinger and the Mormon elder Charlie Hyde. So this debate, it was reported on in all the area newspapers, it lasted 3 days, and it was held in a church that had been formerly used by the Methodists, but had recently been taken over by Mormon converts. Now, while people were not exactly converting in droves, the Mormons were finding success here in South Central Indiana. And each one of these new converts, like Silas, would open up a pathway to then talk to that person's family and friends more deeply about this faith. And when Mormons were refused the use of community buildings, there were sympathetic individuals who would open up their homes, and that allowed elders who were working in the Chapel Hill area to continue their work through the winter and spring of 1890. Now, in response to mounting political pressure from the federal government, the LDS Church president, Wilford Woodruff, issued a manifesto in September of 1890 that advised against any future plural marriage in the church. However, it didn't actually forbid the practice, and so some people questioned the sincerity of such a proclamation. Now, the Bloomington Progress reported that Mormon missionaries were still preaching in Salt Creek Township as of March 1892, and they had just baptized half a dozen converts. They held meetings at the night school, which was about a 5-mile drive through the Salt Creek Valley from Silas Chandler's farm. And this is picture of his house about a decade after his death. Indiana University's student newspaper noted in October 1893 that a graduate from 1871, a Mr. T. Short, had returned to Bloomington to visit friends and relatives and to also serve as a Mormon missionary to the area. Elder Short was from one of those non-polygamous splinter denominations, which was a distinction that he repeatedly often stressed when he was talking, but few people listened to that distinction. During 1893 and 1894, Elder Short seemed to focus on the rural areas south of Bloomington. He was often speaking in Springville and the town of Limestone in Lawrence County. And he was almost definitely making stops in the Salt Creek Valley as he was moving between Bedford and Bloomington. Perhaps Silas Chandler had the opportunity to hear him preach as well. And it may have even been Elder Short himself who ultimately baptized Silas into the Mormon faith on November 11th, 1894. By 1894, that manifesto against polygamy that had been issued by the church in 1890 had actually succeeded in reducing tensions with the federal government. It prompted President Cleveland to issue a pardon in 1894 for anyone who had been convicted of a bigamy offense. Also cleared the path for Utah to finally get statehood in 1896. These were big wins for the LDS Church, likely buoyed the spirits of Mormon converts and missionaries throughout the country. Now, this photo shows some of the elders who were active in the rural areas around Bedford and Bloomington and Nashville during this time period. It was likely taken in the summer of 1895. That's a rough guess just because I know who a lot of the people in this picture were, and I know when they were born, and so I can kind of like piece together based on their apparent ages what the most likely year would have been. So I think summer of 95. The Mormon missionaries are in the very back row, standing up. There were actually 4 of them. One of them was off to the left, and he was lost in a damaged section of this photo. And I don't have names to go with any of the Mormon missionaries. However, I know the people of the other know the other people in this photo, and you're not going to be surprised here to learn that the Chandler family makes up a good portion of them. So we've got James Madison Chandler, Silas's nephew. He's there in the front row. His wife, Mary Ann, also in the front row. Their daughter, Nancy Jane, in between them. Young boy at the far end is Morris. That is Mary Ann's son from a previous marriage to Jonathan Chandler, who is another one of Silas's nephews. There's a daughter from that first marriage whose name was Indiana, and she's in the second row, second from the left. She'd been married roughly a year at the time of this photo, and that child in her arms is probably her firstborn, Elijah. Indiana's sister, Margaret Lois, also from Mary Ann's marriage to Jonathan Chandler, is in the same row. There's a younger girl standing in between them. That's Lena. She was about 10 years old, and she's a daughter from James Madison Chandler's previous marriage. There's a man at the far right, George Bender. And then at the far left is his wife, whose first name I have not been able to track down yet. We've got James Terrell. This is Mary Ann Terrell Chandler's brother. He is off in the damaged portion of the photo that's been lost, along with his wife, Ruth Ann Fleener Chandler, and one of their daughters. And it's almost definitely their youngest child, Alicia, who would have been a toddler at the time. And there's so many like connecting stories here. James later on, I think 1905, this is a completely side story, has nothing to do with the Mormon church, but boy is it interesting. His daughter, Alicia, apparently grows up to be a bit of a bully, and gets in a fight with a neighbor girl. Like there's this going on for a while, and it culminates in a pistol duel between the two fathers on the streets of Bloomington. And James is shot and killed during that battle. And actually, I guess it does tie into the story a little bit, because one of the newspaper reports of his death notes that they were unable to find a Mormon elder who was available to perform his funeral. And so a friend from the Friendship neighborhood in the Friendship Baptist Church performed it instead. So they're off to the left somewhere. Man, I wish that portion of that photo survived. I would have loved to see a picture of Alicia. I've got so many articles about that story. One day, maybe I'll do a program just on that. There's also a man named Jim Smiley and his wife that are also in the damaged section. Silas's youngest living child at the time was Rhoda Louisa, and she was newly married to David Sexton in 1895. They do not appear in this photo, but we know that they did convert together not long after their marriage. Now, by December 1896, Southern Indiana was hosting 14 Mormon missionaries, plus 4 churches, each served by a permanent bishop. One of those churches was located just outside of Bloomington, and the extended Chandler family was likely making up the bulk of the attendees. The elders were still finding new converts in the Salt Creek Valley during the summer of 1897. A group of 8 to 10 elders was going door to door in the Salt Creek Valley to proselytize, and they were holding Sunday meetings there at Silas Chandler's house. Some of these elders also journeyed a bit further south to Bedford, where they pleaded there with the populace to judge them by their own words and actions, not the inflammatory reports that were often being circulated in the newspapers. But opposition to Mormons had not disappeared, as was evident by an incident that occurred in the eastern portion of the Salt Creek Valley in September of 1897. Elder Jones was holding a meeting in the Dewar School, located in southwestern Brown County, when he was interrupted by a shower of eggs. 4 men were charged with the assault, and not unsurprisingly, they were acquitted by a jury of their friends and neighbors. Now, Silas, as I mentioned, he had lived in the Salt Creek Valley since 1828. He was apparently well respected, but that did not save his family from religious persecution. His nephew, who we saw in that photo, James Madison Chandler, one of the attackers in the Dewar School incident, that was one of James's employers. So there was a direct connection there. And Silas's son-in-law and daughter, David and Rhoda Sexton, were harassed repeatedly by the local vigilante group, those white cappers, whose members were among their neighbors. These are people they had known their entire lives. It got bad enough that Silas encouraged Rhoda to move her entire family out to Utah. And they did just that in February of 1901, traveled to Chicago, and took a train to the Heber Mountain Valley, which is just southeast of Salt Lake City. Now, opposition also continued at the national level. Utah's elected representatives and senators were often barred from being seated when they showed up to serve in Congress, because polygamy continued to be practiced by some of the men that were chosen to represent the state. Sometimes, I should say, some of these accusations of polygamy were true and some were not. People weren't too concerned about whether they were true or not, we'll just say that. It was a brush that tarnished all of Utah. This prompted the LDS Church to issue a second manifesto in April 1904, which went beyond just advising against polygamy, and that's when the practice was formally banned within the church. Now, by 1900, the local newspaper reported that Indiana had been such a fruitful recruiting ground for the LDS Church that the state was second only to Utah in its Mormon population. And Silas himself, he continued to do his part to add to that number. And he finally convinced another brother, Isaac, to convert in 1904. Isaac's baptism was scheduled for Sunday, September 25th. Unfortunately, Isaac died on September 21st. And the story is that at the funeral, Isaac came up to the body and he took hold of Isaac's toe and gave it a little shake and said, "Sir, you waited a week too long." Additional members of the extended Sexton family were also drawn into the faith. Unfortunately, they drew the same type of harassment that had sent David and Rhoda packing for Utah. In the fall of 1904, one of the Sextons was physically attacked by the local vigilantes. The following January, as a half dozen of his neighbors appeared in court to answer the charge of riotous conspiracy for that attack, he was planning to follow his relatives and make that move out to Utah. Now, Silas Grantham Chandler died at the age of 82 in August of 1910 due to what the newspaper described as a general breaking down. His funeral was held in the night schoolhouse, which was an appropriate location, given that Silas had likely gone there many times to hear the Mormon elders preach, and he was buried in the family cemetery next to his home. The end of the 1800s was the peak of anti-Mormonism in the United States. However, the sentiments that drove the violent attacks against Mormon missionaries didn't just appear, they just started being expressed in different ways, thankfully less violent ones. Bloomington and other area towns hosted lecturers that were speaking on the evils of Mormonism. You have churches and civic groups organizing petitions against the LDS Church, and politicians are meeting with citizens who are pushing for anti-Mormon action by Congress. In 1915, Bloomington even hosted a Chautauqua that featured a speaker, quote, equipped to expose the methods and secrets of the Mormons. The lectures by that speaker were actually attended by two Mormon elders who were currently doing house-to-house missionary work in Bloomington. And they confronted the speaker following the second lecture and accused him of speaking lies. And that resulted in several attendees banding together to throw the elders out of the tent. Fast forward 100 years, and southern Indiana is friendlier to the Mormon Church than it used to be. Elders no longer must beg for space in private homes like that of Silas Chandler in which to preach. There are now 5 Mormon congregations that actually ring the edges of the Salt Creek Valley region. There's 2 in Bloomington, there are 2 in Columbus, and there is even 1 in Bedford. So anti-Mormonism persists, but it's most often seen now in the form of podcasts, videos, other media, as opposed to the really violent actions that characterized the 1880s and the 1890s. We also still see objectors staging protests during large Mormon gatherings, including the 2015 dedication in Indianapolis of the first Mormon temple in Indiana. And it should be noted that although the actions may have changed, the reasons for modern day opposition differ little from those that were being expressed by residents here in the Salt Creek Valley all the way back into the 1800s. All right. If there are questions, I am happy to try to answer them. Please don't ask me in-depth questions about the history of the Mormon Church. I'm not a religious expert, but pertaining to this story, go for it. Most of the, he asked if I come across any personal narratives of why people were led to convert. I have not. Most of my sources come from newspaper articles, and then there's some collections of family history that are held by the LDS Church. Amazing history archives they have. And so some of the family stories, like I've got some copies of letters from like that Rhoda was like writing back and forth to her residents, to her relatives here in Indiana after she moved, but none of them reference the original conversion. You know, they're just, here's what's my family doing, you know, how's your family doing, sort of things. So, don't know. Yeah, I have not found anything like that. Folks from the History Center, if you've seen anything like that, pass them on to me. but I have never come across something like that. You know, again, most of these people, you know, the newspapers and people were accusing the missionaries of targeting people who were poor and illiterate. That doesn't say much. Most of the people who lived in Monroe County were poor and illiterate. And if you're illiterate, you're not writing much stuff down. So we get some selected stuff from, particularly from some of the people who grew up at the very end of the 1800s, but you know, they're not in their 20s and 30s until the 19-teens and 20s, so after this initial period.
Seems like in general, eggs must have been cheaper.
I mean, everybody had their own chickens. Everyone had their own, literally everyone, even in town, had their own chickens. So yeah, they were a lot more plentiful. Yeah.
People that were Mormons back then, what they do for a living? Mostly farmers?
Yes, and everybody in the rural areas were farmers. There were very few people who weren't farmers. If you did something else, you were still farming. So, yeah. That's a short answer, yes, they were farmers, almost exclusively.
The information that you have, how relevant would it be to use to find out where they own land at? Because could you help me find that?
I know where. I mean, I know where the foundations of Silas Chandler's house were. I've been to them.
Salem Road went across my property. You have to step that. At the same time, we bought part of the property that was leisure land tracts. And when we first bought them, a lot of the old timers down there kept saying that land used to belong to a religious cult. And that was a big story.
Okay, that my guess is that was not the Mormons, but may have been the Holy Rollers. The Holy Rollers. I have not dug nearly as deep into the Holy Rollers, but they were a sect that was very active toward the western end of the Salt Creek Valley in the late 1800s, and they were an offshoot of, I think, the Baptists. Pentecostal, thank you. Yes, some other people here may be more familiar. And the most that I have dug into them has been, there's a grave of one of the people whose burials was moved when the reservoir was built. And the newspaper article about her death references her being part of the Holy Rollers because they didn't believe in medical treatment and doctors. And so they sent for, when she contracted pneumonia, she insisted that they send for no help. And she ended up dying of that. But the Holy Rollers were more active in that end, and the Mormons were more active towards the eastern end of the valley. So that would be a guess, but without digging into it further, I don't know. Deckards are everywhere. You cannot avoid Deckards. I mean, probably half of you in this room, if you're maybe Deckards, if you grew up in Monroe County, I guarantee there's a Deckard in your past. The Chandlers were really centered, their land was really centered in the Friendship area, which was a planned community that never quite happened in what's now the North Fork section of Monroe Lake. So just south of State Road 46 between Bloomington and Nashville, or between Bloomington and Brown County State Park, more accurately. And so most of the Chandlers were down there. Some of the earlier settlers were also in the Payne town area as well. But the area that you are in, I don't think there weren't any Chandlers there at that western end. But I can help you track down names if you need them. Yeah.
You mentioned the church was a Knight family. Does that have anything to do with Knight Ridge Road?
I mentioned the night school, the schoolhouse. Oh gosh, so many. I'd have to check my maps on where exactly the night school was located. Anyone here know off the top of your head? Martha?
Just south on 446, just south of Lampkins Ridge.
There we go.
East side.
446, just south of Lampkins Ridge Road, which is very in the vicinity of Night Ridge, yeah. Yes.
So did the newspaper coverage just stop then once you got to 1900 or so? Or if it did, do we know why?
Yeah, well, it probably continues. At some point, I have to stop. And my kind of interest in the story starts to peter out as they start to move out of this region, and becomes less dominant. And yeah, at some point, I have to pick a stopping point. I went so far down so many holes just with what you got. But also, we do see a changeover in the style of newspaper coverage, beginning, maybe in the 1930s, 1940s, starting to become a little bit more professional, and we get a little less of this sensationalism. I'm not saying it's not still there, and there's certainly still gossip in 1930s and 1940s, but I do think the coverage is a little less of what you saw here, a little bit tamer. Any other questions? Yes.
I expect that the literary work of Jan Ships is in your research materials. Is that true?
I'm not familiar with that name. So,
Bloomington lady,
Uh-huh.
don't believe she's a Mormon, wrote a very apparently even-handed history of rather a famous book. She's a dear family friend for about 60 years.
yeah, I have not run across it, so, yeah. Tell me after I'm not with the mic so I can write it down. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much for coming.